Now, the first thing, so we're going to rewind the clock. And we're going to rewind the clock to about the 15th century. Because this is really the start of what we call the Enlightenment. This is when people started to not take religious dogma as the final fact, but people started to investigate the natural world, started to look outside of just religion to understand things like weather patterns, the stars, the sun, plants, and all of these types of things. Okay. Now, this was very tumultuous, but what it's going to set up is a systematic way of investigating natural phenomenon that is happening in the world that isn't based upon some religious or faith-based perception. Okay. And so what we're going to start with, though, is the one thing that we have to understand predating the 1500s, going into BC, into that, is that we can see across cultures, not just within cultures, the idea of demons, bad spirits, witches. I remember when I was taking my History 122 class at Tonatham Community College. I'm going to torture the name, so please excuse the way I pronounce it. But I was told the story of the Holahawk. I know I'm saying that wrong, but it was a witch demon-like individual that was created out of chaos, as you would say. And I apologize, I can't remember the correct story, but even within Tonatham culture, there's stories about evil and bad spirits and witch-like creatures and those kinds of things. So the idea of demons and witches and bad spirits is kind of a universal human quality. Okay. The culture that is probably going to take this as an extreme and wants to control this process the most would probably be the Western cultures, especially within the European cultures. Okay. And where we need to start with our conversation about mental illness and everything is the concept of demonology. Okay. Demonology kind of comes down to this black and white type of thinking, that there's good people and there's evil people. Okay. Where do good people come from? Good people come from people that hold who are strong-hearted, strong-minded. They know right from wrong, and it's done through a religious conviction. We know what's good or bad because this is what God says is good and bad. And therefore, because we hold these beliefs, we end up with protection from, example, angels or gods. We can see in the Catholic religion the notion of saints being able to intervene or help with certain situations. So this is kind of what the good side of the thing is. Where evil comes from is people who have a weak mind. They are susceptible to a possession. And there's have such weak minds that they turn their backs to God, okay, which makes them more susceptible to temptation and allows possession or control by demons, okay? And if we had even more time, I would even show that there was even some physiological, quote unquote, evidence for this. So if we look at individuals with leprosy who were seen as people who were possessed by the devil and everything like this, most leprosy was caused by, what is that disorder where the bones start to thin? Osteoporosis, okay? As you know, osteoporosis is when the bones start to weaken and they start to create holes in them, right? And they become very, very fragile. Well, the people who investigated the weak-minded said that's where the demons were able to get into the individual's soul, is through those holes, those unkept barriers in the bones and the skull. But those individuals were actually just suffering from osteoporosis. Most individuals who had leprosy, that's kind of one of the causes of it. Okay, so there was even a biological way, according to these people, about how demons were able to get into the weak-minded individual's soul or body. Okay. And so what did this result in is this idea that if you're a strong, healthy individual, you're on the good side. If you're a weak-minded person and fragile person, you're on the bad side. And so anything that happens to you is going to be of evil, a possession of the devil. Anything that happens to the strong-minded person is going to be because of God and because of your virtues. Okay. Now, I'm going to fast forward to our modern times, because that is often the assumption of mental illness, that people who have a mental illness are those who are not hardy, they're not strong, they're not as good-minded as people who don't have a mental illness. Okay, and this is the start of that process. And I want you to think about this as why it's so strong in our society. This is starting in the 1500s. Okay, so this is, if we subtract 2023 from 1400, we get over 900 years of this kind of belief system about mental illness. Okay. And so what do we do with people who tend to be weak-minded or do not act according to the will of God or through God? Okay. Well, the number one process is what we call social exclusion. Okay. This is where, if you've heard movies from about Rome and even above that, when they threaten the individuals that they're going to be exiled. Okay, this is what this meant. And through much of human history, it was pretty much a death sentence to be exiled out of one's community, because we're communal social beings. And so everyone had a great fear of being exiled out of a community. Okay, and when we look at this from a perspective, many of those who were socially excluded were those who were poor and homeless, those who were not seen as worthy of living among, again, the strong-minded individuals. And what this did result in is if you read a lot of mythology and fairy books, you always hear about the dark forests outside of the community, right? Outside the city. Don't go into the forest. It's possessed by demons or witches. Well, this comes from the idea that if you have people who are not meeting that community standards, you assume that they're possessed by the devil or demons. So you throw them outside the community into the forest. And the assumption is they still exist there even after they pass away. Those demons and everything are still there. Okay. So it's used as a fear factor. Don't leave the community. You need to stay here, because if you go out there, you're going to be faced with demons or devils or the like. So that was one tactic. But the other tactic was, it was the assumption that anyone that was socially excluded will go and be seen as existing in the forest in their devil form or their demon form or their witch form. So they're there. Okay. Again, so now let's fast forward to current day. And when we look at poor and homeless individuals, do we say that they're possessed by demons or possessed by the devil? Not necessarily in that same way, But when we look at IAT tests, okay, so this is what we call implicit attitude tests, okay, we find that individuals attribute things that are less than human to homeless and poor individuals than to individuals who are even working class, middle class, or upper class. So when IAT tests, so for example, a picture of a homeless person shows up, and then a picture of a family appears. Okay, that's one scenario. And then in another scenario, a picture of a homeless person appears, and then a picture of a dog appears. Okay, the person is more rapidly associates the dog with the homeless person than the human family with the homeless person. Okay, and so even in today, homeless people are dehumanized. They're seen as less than human, if not on a conscious level, at least on an implicit unconscious level among most individuals that have been tested. Okay, so we still see social exclusion as a method we use to see others as less than. And again, if we look at this from that perspective, we dehumanize homeless individuals, and therefore we exclude them, and we try to keep them separate from the rest of the population. Okay. Now, let's also talk about mental illness. All right. One of the fears that I always came across when someone disclosed having depression or suicidal ideation or anxiety disorder or any of the disorders is they didn't want anyone to know, because of the fear that those people who would find out would exclude them from their life, that their family would reject them, that their friends will start to reject them, that they'll get fired from work, and those types of things. Okay. And so we still see, again, surrounding the stigma of mental illness, the fear of social exclusion. And it came from, again, this 900 years of us excluding certain populations out of the broader social experience. Okay. The other thing that came out of this idea of demonology is the need to protect the weak-minded. Okay. And in this time, what we're seeing as the weak-minded, children, women, and the elderly. So what needed to be done with children, women, and elderly? They needed to be socially controlled. Okay. Because if they weren't controlled, then they were more likely to be possessed by demons and act and destroy the community. Okay. We can easily see this in even things like biblical writing, where it says the man is the master over the woman in order to control her natural tendencies towards promiscuity and those types of things. We can see this with the elderly, that they need to be placed somewhere in a controlled environment, and the same with children. Okay. Again, let's fast forward 900 years to current today. And we can already see that this still continues today. I'll speak specifically to women. The government feels like we need to control their body, control their uteruses, that they in themselves cannot make an individual decision for their family's health and well-being. We still see these types of social controls because women are still seen by the broader culture as having a weaker or lesser mind. Okay. And so even though this has been well disproven, if you've been in one of my other courses, such as Social 101, and I think I mentioned it in Psych 101, women are kicking butt in education, in career, in the home. Right now, women outnumber the number of people going into college, graduating from college. And there's more women going into graduate school right now for the first time in history than men are. And I'm just going to mention this one thing that I've learned about my son a couple of weeks ago is he's in the field of physics, which is a very male-dominated field. But my son's mentors, as he's completing his PhD, his mentors and his advisors have all been women, developing him and teaching him how to be a good physicist and developing his skills to do that. So even though we see that when women are able to go and be who they are and have control over their lives, they can become incredibly successful. On the legal, governmental end, on the power end, we still see the struggle between control over women versus whether or not they can actually make up their own mind on their own, okay? And again, this comes from that 900 years, and we can go before that too. The subjugation of women and elderly go way back in Western history. I can speak a little bit about much of what we see on the American continent pre-colonial is that in many cultures, and I'll just speak to this because I've been talking from a Western perspective, pre-colonial women were actually held at a more equal status with men in most Native American tribal communities because they saw, from the hunter-gatherer perspective and from the agricultural perspective, they saw themselves as equals in duties of the community. But it wasn't until colonialization came along that we saw this deplete among the Native American communities as well. So just to mention that kind of, because there was kind of a difference in societies. And we can also see other non-Western societies where women were actually, they were what we call matriarchal societies, where women were the ones in charge. And even way back in Western culture, we're talking way back, we're talking before about 900 BC, even in Western culture, we were a matriarchal society for a great period of time when we were becoming what we call modernized, or the modern human experience. So those are just some things to mention. But again, again, we'll fast forward to today, who are seen as probably having more mental health issues, while children, women, and the elderly, where men tend to be seen as individuals who should not suffer from mental illness. And this has created a conundrum for men, because again, what we have learned through science with men is they suffer mental illness just as much as women, children, and the elderly. But what we find is many men suffer in silence because it's not permissible for them to express that they're experiencing depression, or they're experiencing anxiety, or they're experiencing delusional thinking, or having a hard time figuring things out. It's become non-accessible. Now that's within our adult population. I think we're doing a little bit better with children, but children were part of this category to begin with. So we see young boys with ADHD, and that seems to be acceptable for that. Autism, those types of things. But we got to remember, when it comes to children were part of this weak-minded category that we started with 900 years ago, okay? And then we also see this idea that forgiveness through God, all things are through God, personal responsibility to the self, but to God, which is, in modern times, we can see this through the responsibility towards the state, okay? That we're responsible to the laws and rules that are established by our governmental entities. And that when we break those laws or those rules, we are responsible to that state or to that government. Okay. And again, this comes from this 900 years going from a religious control society to a secular controlled society. We still brought some of those things that we can only be forgiven through the state or government. And those are our only sources of forgiveness in a sense. So these are some of the kind of modern versions of demonology. This 12-step program, this isn't a hit on 12-step programs. They work very well for some people. But the thing that we have to recognize about 12-step programs as they are originally developed is that the 12-step program is about giving up your addiction and giving yourself to a higher power or to God. Okay. And so this is that kind of thing that we talked about right here with forgiveness through God. Okay. We can look at things like repression therapy when we look at the individuals who are gay or lesbian, where they're brought in to repress those same-sex attractions and try to get them to convert to heterosexualism. And I should note that in 2012, the founder of repression therapy here in the United States actually did a public apology because he felt incredibly guilty about the number of young gay boys and men who committed suicide because of repression therapy. And in 2012, he came out and did a public apology for the damage that his therapy created. Okay. The second form of demonology is what we call neurological pathology. And so, you know, in the past, we blame things on, for example, the possession of demons. And now we're blaming, and I'm going to put this out there, blaming issues of pathology on neurological processes. When neurology is only really the system at which something operates, but it actually doesn't determine behavior. It's associated with behavior. Okay. And then, of course, you know, we do have modern versions of things like devil worship and satanic cults, which we'll get to in later slides. So, is there individuals for which society deems evil, but probably really not? And this is where I want to get into the witch hunts and the witch hunts that started in the 16th century and went clear up into the 18th, and we can even see it into the 19th century. So we're talking 1500s to about the end of the 1800s as a period of time. Okay. And everyone's probably heard of these things, the witch hunts. And so let me kind of get into this as it is defined, okay? Is somewhere in the 16th century. And in the 16th century, we had things like the plague going on that was killing literally millions of people. We had Martin Luther and the Jesuit St. Peter's come out that in their writings, they talk more about the devil than they do Jesus Christ. If you look at Martin Luther's writings, which put this chasm between the Catholic religion and then what we would call the Lutheran religion that then resulted in the Baptists, and all of the other Christian sects within the Christian faith. Okay. If we look at Martin Luther's original writings, he actually mentions the devil more than he does Jesus. as proof that the world is full of evil and that we only can get salvation through our personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Okay. And so this is kind of the Protestant Catholic Reformation that is happening at this time. So we're seeing divisions within the Catholic religion that all are dividing off of the Catholic religion and ending up with the Protestants, the Lutherans, and it's going to end up with the Mormons, the Baptists, and all of those kinds of things. And so we're seeing a schism in the theological and understanding of the predominant religion at the time, which is Christianity. Okay. And because of all this talk about devils, because of the plague, and then there was this evolving secular thing we call science that is starting to evolve during this time. This is where a religious belief about the earth being the center of the galaxy is going to be challenged. And we're going to say, no, the sun is, and the earth rotates around it. This is when challenges to many of the religious beliefs about natural occurrences, such as weather patterns and all of those things, are going to start to be challenged. Okay. And in religion has to respond to that in some way. Religion has to respond to all of this division, all of this death, and then all of these people coming out and saying there's natural explanations for things that are occurring on the earth and in the solar system. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with God or religion. Okay. And so what this is going to result in is this attack on individuals who are not meeting society's expectations. It's going to result in an attack against those who are seen to be possessed by the devil, possessed by things that are supernatural. Okay, and this is going to result in two things, especially in early modern Europe. This is going to result in the witch hunts, which are going to make it across its way here to the United States. Probably the most famous here in the United States is the Salem witch hunts. And it's going to make an attack on what's called the infanticide trials. And just to explain this for just a minute, I think they're right here. I want to start with the infanticide defendants, okay? We have a plague at the time, which is creating a rapid reduction in human population. And so one of the natural things that we want is for us to reproduce more to make sure our populations can be sustained, okay? And so therefore, if we take it from a religious perspective, if an infant is born stillborn, or if an infant dies in early birth, from a paranoia perspective, we see that as the work of the devil, because the plague is the work of the devil. These people who are dying all around us is the work of the devil. Okay, therefore, infanticide, which if we remember rewinding back to homicide, is the purposeful death of an infant by an adult or another individual. We see in this period what are called the infanticide trials. Okay, but it's not necessarily targeted towards everyone who has a stillborn or miscarries or has a child who dies early in infancy. No, the focus is totally on young women who live in towns and cities, who are unmarried and part of the lower class. Okay. And these are the individuals that are targeted for this infanticide trials in this early century. Okay. Now, again, let's fast forward 900 years. It wasn't until late 70s or even into the 80s. It was even a stigma in the 80s and the 90s to have a teenager who was pregnant. If we look at pre-70s into the 60s, 50s, and 40s, if your teen daughter got pregnant, you would usually send her away somewhere, or you'd go do a back alley abortion or something like that to save the family's embarrassment for that young girl getting pregnant. Okay. It wasn't until we recognized things about human sexuality into the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, where these ideas were started to be less stigmatic. But even today, we look at teen pregnancy as a social wrong. If you look at the literature on teen pregnancy, the focus is on all the negative aspects of a teen being pregnant, but there's very, very few studies that have actually looked at any type of benefits or you won't find a study like that. So we still, even today, even in modern science, focus on this negativity about young girls getting pregnant, okay? And again, from the PSY trials, we're not going to blame the male. Remember, during this time, and it's still with us today, men are not weak, according to this idea. And so we still see that young women are the ones who are blamed, especially teens, for getting pregnant. It has nothing to do with the young male, okay? And this comes from hundreds of years of these infanticide trials. And if we wonder why young women leave their born infants in a dumpster or leave them uncared for, I think we need to look at the past 900 years of how we treated young, lower class women who have gotten pregnant. Because if you were born in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, that young woman would have been put to death because it would have been seen as a homicide. Okay. So again, we see this trend of past bad thinking. And this is where, when we say, in a lot of classes and whatnot, we talk about cultural transmission. We talk about things like historical trauma, those kinds of things. These are some of the things from Western culture that has followed us to today in modern American culture. Okay. Now let's look at the typical characteristics of a defendant who was a witch. Okay. We tend to see that the witches tended to be older, past usually childbearing years, tended to be rural. And again, we see this idea of lower class. And we tended to define them as having a quarrelsome personality, or what they call a smedum, okay? Which is, for Scottish, it's a word for feistiness, okay? What we have found is that many of these individuals, if we look at their actual case, usually suffered from some type of mental illness, suffered from years of trauma and those types of things, but they were the ones that were defined as witches, okay? And so again, we see this attack on lower class. We also see the attack on mainly females. And it all has to deal with things like, are they capable of giving birth or not? And we will see this as we continue our conversation. I'm going to stop right here because we're almost out.